I don't think most people would believe me if I told them my own daughter called me a selfish old man on my 64th birthday, but she did. And her husband, the man I helped put through his MBA, stood right there beside her and nodded. That was the beginning of what I now call the most important weekend of my life. My name is Raymond if you ask my late mother. I worked 31 years for a mid-sized engineering firm out of Kitchener, Ontario, the kind of steady, unglamorous career that lets you retire at 63 with a paid-off house, a reasonable RRSP, and enough left over that you don't lie awake at night worrying about the hydro bill. I'm not wealthy by any definition that would impress the people my daughter married into, but I own my home outright. A 4-bedroom brick house on a quiet street in Waterloo, the house where my kids grew up, the house where my ex-wife and I raked leaves every October for 22 years before she passed away from a stroke in 2019. I live alone now, and I like it that way. I want to say that clearly because it becomes important later. I am 64 years old. I drive myself to my cardiologist appointments. I play hockey on Wednesday evenings in a recreational league. Yes, I still play hockey. I've been playing since I was 7. And I volunteer 2 mornings a week at a food bank near my house. I am not confused. I am not fragile. I am not lonely in the way people assume a widower living alone must be. I made peace with solitude a long time ago, and it suits me. My daughter is 34. Her husband, Callum, no wait. I've decided I'm going to call him what I always privately called him after that weekend. I'll call him the Suit. He works in commercial real estate in Mississauga. They have a condo and a building that costs more per month than my first mortgage payment. They drive matching SUVs. They spend money the way people do when they've never truly had to go without, quickly, confidently, and without much thought for what comes next. I had noticed over the previous year or so that their calls had become more frequent. Not the nice kind of frequent, not the check-in, how are you, just thinking of you kind, the purposeful kind. Every conversation found its way, eventually, to money. The condo fees had gone up. The Suit's commissions had been slow this quarter. My daughter's dental practice. She's a dentist, built a good practice over 10 years. I'm proud of her for that. Was going through a billing software transition that was absolutely bleeding them dry. I listened. I sympathized. I did not offer to write checks because they never directly asked, and I told myself maybe I was imagining the subtext. I was not imagining it. My son, who lives in Halifax and calls me every Sunday without fail, had warned me. He said, "Dad, I don't want to create drama, but I think they're in more trouble than she's letting on." I thanked him and told him I'd pay attention. He's a good kid, a straight shooter. He works in marine engineering, modest salary, happy life. Never once looked at my house as anything other than the place he grew up. The birthday dinner was my daughter's idea. She suggested coming up to Waterloo for the weekend of my birthday in late September. Just the 3 of us, she said. She'd cook, make it a proper family occasion. I was touched. I cleaned the house, bought a good bottle of wine, put fresh sheets on the guest room bed. They arrived Friday evening. The Suit shook my hand at the door with that particular grip men use when they want you to know they're confident. My daughter hugged me, told me I looked well. We had a nice dinner, talked about nothing serious, and I genuinely thought maybe I'd been too suspicious. Saturday morning I made pancakes, the recipe my mother used, the one I've made every Saturday morning for 40 years. We sat around the kitchen table, coffee, the October light coming through the window. My daughter asked if I'd thought any more about downsizing. I told her I hadn't. I told her I liked the house. She said she understood, but had I considered that 4 bedrooms was a lot of space for one person? She said it practically, gently, the way she talks to patients when she's about to tell them something they don't want to hear. I recognized the tone because I'd watched her develop it over years. I said, yes, 4 bedrooms is a lot of space, and I enjoy having the space. Then the suit said it. He said that her parents were thinking of moving from Brampton. I put my coffee mug down. He said the condo wasn't working for them long term. He said they were getting older. Her mother had some hip trouble. Her father was having a hard time with the stairs. He said the real estate market in the GTA was brutal right now, as I probably knew. He said it would only be temporary, a year maybe, 18 months at the outside, just while they sorted out their situation and found something suitable. I said, "You're talking about your in-laws moving into my house?" He smiled. He actually smiled. He said, "You have the space, Ray. It seems like a shame for it to sit empty." My daughter jumped in immediately, which told me they had rehearsed this, or at least discussed it enough that she knew exactly where he was going. She said, "Dad, we're not asking you to give anything up. They'd have the 2 back bedrooms, you'd still have your room and your office. It would barely change your day to day." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about what I wanted to say. I said very clearly that I was not going to do that. I said I had nothing against her in-laws. I had met them twice at the wedding, and they seemed like pleasant people. But this was my house, and I wasn't interested in having permanent house guests, related by marriage or otherwise. The suit's smile went somewhere else. He said I was being short-sighted. I said I preferred to think of it as knowing my own mind. My daughter said, "Dad, they have nowhere else to go." I said, "That's a problem for us to find a different solution to." She pushed back her chair. Her voice changed, not loud, but tight, compressed, the way it used to get when she was a teenager and believed she was the only rational person in the room. She said that I sat in this big empty house doing nothing with all this space, while real people had real problems, and that it would cost me absolutely nothing to help her family, and that she didn't understand why I was being so selfish. There it was. Selfish. 64 years old, 31 years of work, raised 2 kids largely on my own after my wife got sick the first time in 2011, and the word being applied to me was selfish. I said, "I'm going to ask you not to speak to me that way." The suit said, "She's just telling you the truth." My daughter said it again. She said, "You are being selfish, Dad. You're sitting on all of this and you won't give up 2 bedrooms for a year. Do you know how that looks?" I stood up from the table. I said I was going to take a walk. The suit said, "That's your answer? You're just going to walk away?" I said walking away from an unproductive conversation was not the same as not having an answer. I went to the front closet, got my jacket, and I left. I walked for 45 minutes. I went past the park where I used to take the kids on weekends, past the arena where my son had his first hockey practice, past the coffee shop where my wife and I used to go on Sunday mornings when the kids were in high school and we wanted an hour to ourselves. I thought about a lot of things on that walk. I thought about a phone call I'd had 3 months earlier with a friend of mine, Norm. Norm had retired from the same company I did, about 2 years before me, and his situation had gone sideways in a way I hadn't expected. His daughter and her partner had moved in temporarily during the pandemic, had never left, had gradually taken over more and more of the house until Norm was effectively living in 2 rooms. And now he was trying to figure out how to get his own house back without destroying his relationship with his grandchildren in the process. Norm had told me this over a beer on his back porch, where he could no longer sit without someone coming out to ask him something, and he'd said, "The moment you let that door open, Ray, you will never fully close it." I had not forgotten that conversation. I came back to the house. My daughter was in the kitchen washing dishes, back to the door. The suit was in the living room, looking at his phone. The atmosphere was the particular kind of cold that only comes from a fight that isn't finished yet. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said to my daughter, without raising my voice, that I understood she was in a difficult position, that I understood her in-laws needed help, and that I was willing to help think through options. Rental assistance, a list of senior-friendly buildings in Waterloo region, looking into whether they qualify for any provincial housing support programs. But I was not going to turn my home into a residence for people I barely knew, and that was a final answer. She turned around from the sink. She said, "So that's it, you've decided?" I said yes. She said, "I can't believe you sometimes. I genuinely cannot believe you." She was crying now, real tears, which made it harder. She said, "They're going to have to go into some cheap rental in a terrible neighborhood because you won't do one small thing." The suit appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had put his phone away. He said, "You know what your problem is, Ray. You've been alone so long you've forgotten how to think about anyone other than yourself. You sit here in this house that Janet helped pay for." He said my late wife's name. He said, "Janet helped pay for this house, and this is how you honor that." I went very still. I said slowly, "Don't." He said, "No, I think it needs to be said. She would be ashamed of you right now." My daughter said, "Callum," which means his name really is Callum, I suppose. The mask slipped. I stood up. I said, "I'm going to ask you both to leave. Not tomorrow morning, tonight." My daughter said I was overreacting. The suit said I was being ridiculous. Neither of them moved. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and I called my son in Halifax. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He said, "Dad, do you want me to come?" I said no, I was fine. I said I just wanted him to know in case he heard a different version later. He said, "I've got you." Then I called my lawyer. My lawyer's name is Genevieve. She's been my estate and family lawyer for 11 years, since before Janet died. She'd done our wills when the kids were young, updated everything after Janet passed, helped me with the house transfer. She's thorough, direct, and doesn't waste words. I called her cell because we have that kind of relationship, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and I knew she'd pick up. She picked up. I gave her the condensed version. She said, "Did he threaten you?" I said, "Not in so many words." She said, "Did they refuse to leave when you asked?" I said they hadn't left yet. She said, "Ray, take pictures of everything in the house before they go, every room, and text me when they're gone." Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I think it's time we revisit your estate documents." I said, "I was thinking the same thing." She said, "Monday morning, I'll have Priya set it up." I went back out to the kitchen. My daughter and the suit were standing near the front door with their overnight bags. My daughter looked like she'd been crying more. The suit looked like a man who had decided to be very calm because he believed that was the powerful thing to do. My daughter said, "We'll talk when you've had time to think." I said, "Safe drive." The suit looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I don't think so." They left. I heard the SUV pull out of the driveway. I stood in my front hallway for a minute. Then I went to every room in the house. Kitchen, living room, dining room, my bedroom, the office, the 2 guest rooms, the garage, and I took photographs on my phone. Time-stamped, clear. Everything as it was. Then I went back to the kitchen, finished my tea, and made myself dinner. My son called back at 8 o'clock. We talked for an hour. He asked me how I was. I said I was okay. I said I was more okay than I expected to be. I told him about calling Genevieve. He said, "Good." I told him about the estate documents. He said, "Dad, you don't have to do that for me. I want you to know that." I told him I knew, and that's partly why I was doing it. I slept fine that night. I'm not sure I expected to, but I did. Monday morning, I drove to Genevieve's office. She's on King Street, third floor of one of those heritage buildings with the original brick walls inside. Her assistant Priya had coffee ready. Genevieve had printed out my existing documents and had a pad of notes already. She walked me through everything. She said, "Your will as it stands splits the estate equally. House, RRSP proceeds, investment accounts, everything." She paused. She said, "You can change that. You have every right to change that. The only question is what you want." I told her what I wanted. She wrote it down. She asked me a few clarifying questions. She said the changes would take about a week to finalize. She said, "Ray, one more thing." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. "I want you to read this." It was a printout of a section of the Ontario Elder Abuse Prevention Network resources. She'd added a handwritten note at the top that said, "For your awareness." She said what had happened at my house over the weekend had elements she thought I should be informed about. She used the phrase financial coercion. She said she wasn't telling me what to do with that information, but she wanted me to have it. I read it on the drive home. My daughter called on Tuesday. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was conciliatory. She said she was sorry for how the conversation had gone, that emotions had gotten high, that she hoped we could talk. She did not apologize specifically for what was said about Janet. Neither, of course, did the suit. I called her back Wednesday. I said I appreciated her reaching out. I said I wanted her to know that I had been to see Genevieve and that I had made some changes to my estate plans that I thought she should be aware of. I said I wasn't telling her this to punish her. I said that clearly because I meant it. I was telling her because I believe in transparency and because she had a right to know before she heard it from anyone else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked what kind of changes. I said the house was no longer going to be part of the shared estate split. I said I was setting it up as a specific bequest to a land trust that supports affordable housing in Waterloo region. Janet had cared about housing equity. She'd volunteered with a non-profit in this area for 6 years before she got too sick. It felt right. The financial accounts would still be divided between the kids equally as before. My daughter said, "Dad." I said, "I'm not finished." I said the suit's comment about Janet, using her name to suggest she would be ashamed of me, had crossed a line that I needed her to understand was permanent. I said I did not want to hear his voice in my house again until I had a direct apology, not passed through her, but from him directly. I said this was not a condition I was placing in anger. I had slept on it for several nights, and I was certain. She started crying again. She said she didn't know he was going to say that. I believed her. I said I understood that, and it didn't change what I was asking for. She said, "What do I tell his parents?" I said, "That's a conversation between you and your husband." I heard her take a breath. She said, "Are we okay, Dad? You and me?" I said, "We're going to be okay. But that doesn't happen in this phone call." We talked for a few more minutes. I told her I loved her. She told me the same. We hung up. I sat in the living room for a while after that. The afternoon light was coming through the front window the way it does in late September, low, golden, the kind that makes the dust motes visible in the air. The house was quiet, my house. The same 4 walls where I'd taught my kids to play cards, where we watched hockey games together in the basement, where Janet sat in the chair by the window in her last year because that was the spot she liked best. My son called that Sunday as usual. I told him most of it. He said, "How are you feeling?" I said honestly. I said I felt a little like a man who had been warned about a storm, watched it come in, and found out his roof held. He laughed. He said, "That sounds like you." I kept the house. I'm keeping the house. I still play hockey on Wednesday evenings. I still volunteer at the food bank on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I still make pancakes on Saturday with my mother's recipe. Last month, I drove up to visit my son in Halifax for a week. We went out on the water with one of his colleagues. First time I'd been on a proper boat in years. And I thought about Janet the whole time in the good way, the way you eventually learn to do. The suit has not called. My daughter has been texting, slowly, carefully, like someone walking back towards something they knocked over and hoping it can be repaired. I think it can be in time. She is my daughter and I love her without condition. But love without condition doesn't mean without consequence. And the older I get, the clearer that distinction becomes. Genevieve's office sent the finalized documents in October. I signed them on a Tuesday afternoon. Priya witnessed it. Genevieve shook my hand at the door. She said, "You did the right thing." I said I thought so too. I drove home on the 401 with the windows down even though it was cold. Past the Kitchener exit, past the signs for Cambridge, the flat gray sky of southern Ontario in fall, pressing down on the highway like a hand on a shoulder. My phone rang. I let it go. I was driving. Checked it when I got home. It was my daughter. I called her back. She said, "Hi, Dad." I said, "Hi, sweetheart." She said, "I wanted to tell you something. I told Callum what you said about the apology." She paused. "He said he'd think about it." I said, "That's a start." She said, "I'm sorry too. For my part in it, I should have shut it down differently. I should have." Her voice went sideways a little. "I should have protected you better." I said, "You're my kid. I'm supposed to protect you. That's how it's supposed to go." She laughed a little, wet around the edges. She said, "Happy belated birthday, Dad." I said, "Thank you, sweetheart." I made dinner after that. Nothing fancy. Chicken, a salad, some leftover rice. I ate at the kitchen table with the radio on, the CBC, someone talking about something in Ottawa. The house was quiet in the way I like it, the way I've earned it. 64 years old, and I am just getting started. I keep coming back to something Norm said on his back porch that afternoon. The porch he could no longer sit on alone. He didn't say it as advice. He said it the way you say something when you've already learned it the hard way and there's nothing left to do but pass it along. He said the moment you let that door open, you will never fully close it. I heard him, and when the moment came, I remembered. That's not luck. That's what happens when you pay attention to the people around you and take their hard-won experience seriously. I think a lot of what we call wisdom is really just that. Borrowed knowledge you are humble enough to actually listen to. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this settled. My daughter is not a bad person. I want to say that plainly, because the story sounds damning when you lay it out like that. The pressure, the rehearsed conversation, the name they put in Callum's mouth. But she's someone who got caught between a husband who pushed too hard and a father she thought she could move. She miscalculated. And when the pressure came, she let herself cross a line she can't fully walk back from, not quickly anyway. That's a consequence, not a punishment I designed, a natural consequence of the choices she made in that kitchen. I didn't invent the discomfort she's sitting with now. She created it herself the moment she decided to stay quiet while her husband invoked Janet's name as a weapon. I think that's what people mean when they talk about living with integrity. Not that you never make mistakes, but that you understand eventually that the things you do leave marks on other people, yes, but also on your own sense of who you are. Callum has to live with what he said. My daughter has to live with what she didn't say, and I have to live with how I responded. I'm at peace with my part. What I'm most proud of, and I say this not to congratulate myself because the situation was painful and I'd have preferred it never happened, is that I didn't react from anger. I walked away when I needed to. I called the right people. I thought clearly when someone was counting on me being too emotional to think. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of making decisions under pressure and learning, slowly, that the first response is rarely the best one. I'm 64. I have been a son, a husband, a father, an engineer, a widower, a hockey player, a food bank volunteer. I have buried the woman I loved. I have raised 2 children largely alone. I have made my share of mistakes, and I have tried, most of the time, to make them right. What I have not done, and what I will not do, is apologize for surviving all of that with my spine intact. The house is still mine. The phone call I made to Genevieve that Saturday afternoon was the right one. The documents I signed in October were the right ones. Not because I won something, but because I acted in line with what I actually believe about fairness, about honesty, about what Janet would have genuinely wanted, which was never to be used as leverage against me. 64 is not the beginning of the end. For some of us, it's when we finally stop being afraid to say exactly what we mean.